Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is the second lecture in a two-lecture series on Chapter 2 of Horkheimer's Eclipse of Reason, which is titled Two Panaceas. And just to remind you, I've already talked about positivism and his critique of positivism in my first lecture on Chapter 2, and in this lecture I will be discussing Neo-Thomism. Just to recall Horkheimer's thesis for this chapter, two philosophies today, positivism and its neo-positivist form, and Neo-Thomism, serve as panaceas and not real alternatives to the domination of subjective rationality. So you may remember from chapter 1, Horkheimer is concerned about the dominance of subjective rationality in our culture today and the fact that it prevents us from evaluating ends or judging ends. And this leads to greater and greater conformity to reality. In this chapter, he's going to talk about how positivism and Neo-Thomism lead to greater and greater conformity to reality. Just to recap the first lecture, positivism leads to greater conformity to reality because it is about verifiability, which means we verify what we see, we don't question what we see. But in this lecture, I want to talk about Neo-Thomism. So when Horkheimer talks about Neo-Thomism, he's talking about a particular kind of philosophical movement that tries to resurrect some of Thomas Aquinas' philosophy for the modern period. There's a question about who he's talking about here. He doesn't name any of the Neo-Thomists. He does name some of the positivists. The positivists that he talks about are Hooke and Dewey, but he does not name any of the Neo-Thomists. But we can probably take the idea of what's going on in history at this time and just look who's following Leo the 13th. Leo the 13th writes Aeterni Patris, which is saying that Thomas Aquinas is a father for the ages and that the church should embrace his teaching. And out of that comes people like G.K. Chesterton, Jacques Maritain, and Etienne Gilson, who defend Thomistic principles for the modern period, so trying to bring Thomas Aquinas into the modern period. Now, even though I agree with lots of what Horkheimer says in his discussion about Neo-Thomism, I do think it's important that at least Maritain and Gilson made attempts to engage Thomism for the modern period. The kinds of ways that they went about it, I think, fall to the critique that Horkheimer lays out. So what is that critique? Well, the basic idea is that the metaphysical ideas of Thomism, so for example, the transcendentals of truth, oneness, and goodness, become commodities for dogmatic and religious purposes. And in particular, the absolute becomes a commodity. It's used as a means. So when we think about the absolute here, we're thinking about the concept of God and the way that that concept as an absolute concept stultifies thinking. And Horkheimer goes into a big discussion about how God is conceived as unmutable and yet reality is mutable. And so there's a disconnect between God and reality, but with the focus on God as absolute and unmutable, it means that we tend to conform to reality rather than questioning. So we are not allowed to question the papacy. We're not allowed to question church authority figures. I think this was much truer in Horkheimer's day before Vatican II than it was after Vatican II. And it also depends on who is Pope and who is Cardinal. We've seen a big discussion since Pope Francis has taken over, or has been elected, to Pope, where there's a much greater embrace, at least from his papacy, for questioning and for looking at mercy rather than for conformity to rules and conformity to authority as such. Some of that has to arise out of the church sex abuse scandal. And we have to recall that it's exactly the kind of thing that Horkheimer is talking about in terms of using the idea of the absolute as unquestionable and thinking of the Pope as infallible and thinking of the priest as infallible that led to the church sex abuse scandal, so that people would have their children abused by a priest, and they would go and they would complain, and they were told, well, you can't bring the church into the dirt, and so we're just going to move this guy over here, or don't question the church. And of course, this led to children, of course, easily being manipulated by the priest, because the priest would say, I'm someone that you shouldn't question. And there's a side part of that, which is true for almost any time period, that religion helps to maintain the social order. It helps to maintain order within the social realm, because it provides non-material punishments for breaking the social order. So all of these things are going through Horkheimer's mind. We have the more recent example of the church sex abuse scandal. The picture that you see there is the way that priests used to celebrate Mass before Vatican II, with their backs to the parishioners. The parishioners would be mumbling to themselves or praying to themselves, because the Mass was celebrated in Latin. Today there's a big movement to have even to keep Mass in English, but to have the priest turn his back to the people. And this shows, again, the separateness of the priest from the worshipers. So Horkheimer doesn't want to say that we need to go back to Thomas. He wants to say instead that objective reason, the kind of reason that Thomism represented, had to give way because it was too weak to protect individuals from the domination of social pariahs. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about individuality. But the more important idea today is that objective reason is often used as an instrument to avoid chaos, rather than as an instrument to critique society. Alistair MacIntyre says in his Notes from Moral Wilderness that, in fact, Christianity has two goals. That any religion has two purposes. One is to sustain society, and one is to question society. And in our day and age, it's the sustaining of society and the lack of questioning that is important. If you go and watch this video here, it's an interview of Cardinal Dolan by the Fox News Network. And I want you to pay attention to what's being said here about gifts, but also about productivity. And remember that Horkheimer is very concerned about critiquing culture as focused on the production of commodities. And if you particularly pay attention to time 240, you'll see that there's this discussion of relating Christmas to productivity. Even though in the beginning there's an attempt to get away from the idea of Christmas and giving things productivity, here there's a more focus on how commodities make us feel good about ourselves. And so it's actually conforming to reality. And then later in the video, they talk about Pope Francis as a gift, as if he's something that can be bought or sold. He's a commodity himself. So the idea here is that religion, whether it's Catholicism, Thomism, Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, can be used as a means of conformity. And we see this in the way, for example, that Coca-Cola comes out with Santa Claus and markets Santa Claus on their Christmas Coke cans. Christmas means being together, but of course, that's just a sales tool for marketing Coca-Cola. And this interesting comic here, Blood of Christ in the Coke bottle, can't beat the real thing. And the idea that we are conforming to reality by using religion, right, to reconcile our individual thinking to mass manipulation. That's what we see with Coca-Cola, and we see with many other things at Christmas time, at Easter time, and throughout the year, these religious ideas being used to manipulate us. And here, Horkheimer gets into this idea of negation. So the very idea of God becomes self-contradictory, an entity that is supposed to be absolute yet does not include change. And so he goes on with this critique to say that the failure of Thomism lies in its ready acquiescence to pragmatic aims rather than its lack of practicability. When a doctrine hypostasizes an isolated principle that excludes negation, it is paradoxically predisposing itself to conformism. So critical thought requires some form of negation. We look at reality and say it could be different. The kids who were involved in the school shooting in Parkland, for instance, are saying reality must be different. So there's a negation of the status quo, a negation of conformity to reality. And Horkheimer is saying that with the idea of God as absolute, there is no concept of negation there. And so it's not possible to use that concept of God to question reality. And Thomism also has this problem because it goes to pragmatic aims. How do we use Thomism to resolve issues today, rather than what is the truth that Thomism offers us to question reality as it is? So he goes on to say that the greatest defect in Thomism lies in its making truth and goodness identical with reality. And this goes back to this concept of transcendentals within Thomistic metaphysics, is the idea that there are certain things that are identical to being as such. These things are truth, oneness, and goodness. And so if you say that reality, that being is one with truth and goodness, that means that we cannot question reality because it's already good. And that means that we end up in things like what Stephen Colbert calls truthiness, right? Where reality is unquestioned because we already know what the truth is. And we end up in situations like the Milgram experiment. So the positivist command to conform to facts and common sense instead of to utopian ideas is not so different from the call to obey reality as interpreted by religious institutions. Science becomes a religion today, and religion is part of conforming to reality as it is. So some questions to think about. How does religion work today for you? Does it support the status quo? Does it question the status quo? How does science fit in? Who's in charge of science religion? One of the greatest dystopian novels of all time is The Canticle for Leibowitz, and that question comes up in that essay. But the idea here for us is to think about how do we question reality, and how are we taught to conform to reality? And that's where the domination of subjective reason fits in. The domination of subjective rationality fits in because it's about the self-preservation of the ego, which we will get into in the next chapter and next lecture.